Over the next few Sundays, I plan to preach a series I did a few years ago, a series about the prophet Elijah. This morning I'm bringing an introductory message to help us understand the historical background. We will spend some time thinking about three kings who, in different ways, acted very foolishly. Since we won't be investigating each of these characters in depth, we will be reading only parts of these chapters. And I encourage you to read these chapters at home. The Lord became angry with Solomon because his heart had turned away from the Lord, the God of Israel, who had appeared to him twice. Though he had forbidden Solomon to follow other gods, Solomon did not keep the Lord's command. God, in his grace, had allowed Solomon to become king after David died, even though he was the son of Bathsheba. People came from great distances to hear Solomon's wisdom. He made his nation so wealthy that gold was commonplace. He built a great and beautiful temple to honor the Lord, the Eternal One. But in chapter 11, we read that Solomon had 700 wives and 300 concubines. This makes us uncomfortable. Why did God put this in the Bible? Well, first, because the Bible is truthful about people. And second, because we can learn something from the uncomfortable parts, too. As Christians, we believe and teach that marriage is between one man and one woman. Until recently, that has been the custom in our culture. When we think of polygamy, we immediately think of sexual sin, and rightly so. However, notice that the focus of God's anger against Solomon has to do with the fact that his foreign wives had led him away from a single-minded worship of the Lord, the Eternal One, to a worship of many other gods. Notice the steps of his sin. It began with having many wives. Although polygamy wasn't forbidden, God had set a pattern in the beginning when he created Adam and Eve, one man and one woman. The next step was breaking God's direct command not to intermarry with the unbelieving nations around them. It was forbidden to have foreign wives. Not because of any prejudice against foreigners, but because those women would lead their husbands into the worship of other gods. It's difficult enough to live a godly life with a supportive spouse. And Solomon's foreign wives did lead him into sin. The third step involves doing something that seems like the kind thing to do, keeping his wives happy. But Solomon does so by providing the venues and whatever they need for them to worship their own gods. And the fourth step is that he begins to worship these gods as well. There are two lessons in this for us. First, watch out for those things and those people who pull us away from our love of God. In Solomon's case, it was his love of women, particularly of women who served other gods. Second, our sins usually start small, but become progressively worse. Solomon ignored God's plan, disobeyed God's command, and eventually found himself worshiping idols. God's rebuke to Solomon mentions the fact that he had appeared to him twice already. The first time was just after he became king. He prayed for wisdom, and God was pleased, and God granted him wisdom, and also wealth and honor. The second time was when Solomon had completed the temple. God promised to bless Solomon and his descendants if they would worship and serve him wholeheartedly. God had appeared to Solomon in dreams, which was rare. God usually communicated through the prophets. But Solomon had not appreciated the opportunity, and he had not respected God. Indeed, he'd gone so far as to bow down in the worship of false gods. Verse 11. So the Lord said to Solomon, "Since this is your attitude, and you've not kept my covenant and my decrees, which I commanded you, I will most certainly tear the kingdom away from you and give it to one of your subordinates." Solomon, it seemed, had everything: wisdom, riches, power. He had a special relationship with God, who had used him to build his temple. But Solomon had turned away. He was not devoted wholeheartedly to God. And so this is God's response. He will give Solomon's kingdom to a subordinate. Notice that God doesn't give Solomon a way out. God doesn't say, "Your foreign wives led you astray, so you aren't responsible." Yes, his wives had led him astray, but no, that didn't excuse him. He was responsible. Nor will you and I be able to stand before God someday and blame someone else for what we have or haven't done. Verse 12. "Nevertheless, for the sake of David your father, I will not do it during your lifetime. I will tear it out of the hand of your son. Yet I will not tear the whole kingdom from him, but will give him one tribe for the sake of David my servant and for the sake of Jerusalem, which I have chosen." Even in punishing Solomon, God is gracious. He won't take away the kingdom during Solomon's lifetime, and he won't take away the entire kingdom. "However, as for you, I will take you, and you will reign over all that your heart desires. You will be king over Israel." This is the second king we're talking about this morning, Jeroboam. When we first meet him, he's an official in Solomon's government, in public works, in charge of labor. And one day Jeroboam was met by a prophet named Ahijah, and the first part of Ahijah's message was a counterpart of God's message to Solomon. And then the prophet added what we read just here, that God would give him his heart's desire to rule over Israel. But there was even more. "If you do whatever I command you, and walk in my ways and do what is right in my eyes, by obeying my statutes and commands, as David my servant did, I will be with you. I will build you a dynasty as enduring as the one I built for David, and will give Israel to you." God also made Jeroboam a promise. He promised that his dynasty would last as long as David's. But that promise was conditional. He would have to be like David and be wholehearted in his devotion to God. Now, this is an important point. God is taking away this kingdom from Solomon's descendants because of Solomon's unfaithfulness. He's asking that Jeroboam be faithful, and is promising that in return, if he is faithful, God will make his dynasty an enduring dynasty. What a tremendous opportunity is offered to Jeroboam. He can have God's blessing. He can have an enduring kingdom. All he has to do is be faithful to God. This is a lesson for us. Many of God's promises are conditional. These stories from the Old Testament are pre-Christian, but they establish for us an understanding of how God does things. And one of the clearest is that God does make conditional promises. Seldom does God make totally unconditional promises. He doesn't say, "Even if you cease to walk with me, I'll still give you all the benefits of walking with me." Typically, as in this story, God's blessings are conditional. We may find this a bit disturbing. We all know people who have been followers of Jesus and have wandered away. Some would say they've fallen away from God's grace. Others would say they must have never experienced grace in the first place. Well, setting aside that discussion for this morning, let's just notice that God expects Jeroboam to have a heart dedicated to serve him like David did. He doesn't say that Jeroboam has to be perfect. God forgave David for the sins of adultery and murder. But we are told that David was a man after God's heart. If Jeroboam dedicates himself to serve the Lord, then he'll be blessed. This is really a picture of what God expects of us too. God expects of us hearts that long to serve him. And this means serving him wholeheartedly. There's another lesson in this. God is asking Jeroboam to serve him for the rest of his life. It might be a challenge in the short term for Jeroboam to dedicate himself to God, but the long-term result is a dynasty to follow after him. In our day, people think about their legacy. Politicians think about their legacy. I write stories for my grandchildren, in part to pass on my legacy. Everyone who faces death wants to live on in the memory of those who come after. But Jeroboam has offered more than a legacy. He's offered a dynasty. Have you ever thought of eternity that way? God expects us now to turn ourselves over to him and to live our short lives here on earth for him. And in exchange, we gain life everlasting. Let's turn our attention now to the third king, Rehoboam. 3 days later, Jeroboam and all the people returned to Rehoboam, as the king had said, "Come back to me in 3 days." And the king answered the people harshly. Rehoboam was the son of Solomon. He was born shortly before his grandfather David's death, so he would only know of David's walk with God by what he was told. He was about 8 when Solomon finished building the temple, so he knew something of the expectations of God. Indeed, he knew enough of God's expectations to rebel against them in 2 Chronicles 12, and to repent after God punished him with defeat by his enemies. Yet he was not really a godly man. Rehoboam ascended the throne of Israel after his father died. Jeroboam, whom we have just met, was not yet king of Israel. He was part of the delegation sent to Rehoboam, asking him to lighten their load. Life had been tough under Solomon's rule. They wanted Rehoboam to give them a break. Rehoboam had gone to his father's advisors. They suggested that he do what the people asked, and thus earn their loyalty. He went to his buddies, to his peer group, and asked for their advice. Their advice was to be even tougher than Solomon. So Rehoboam answered the delegation harshly. Rejecting the advice given to him by the elders, he followed the advice of the young men and said, "My father made your yoke heavy. I will make it even heavier. My father scourged you with whips. I will scourge you with scorpions." I said that Rehoboam wasn't a particularly godly man. I think that's why he went for practical advice rather than godly advice. Contrast that with Solomon, his father, who prayed for God's wisdom when he took over the throne of David, his father. Rehoboam could have consulted a prophet. But he did ask the elders in his father's entourage for advice. Now, these were men who would have had Solomon's dynasty at heart. They would have watched Rehoboam grow from childhood, and they would have his interest at heart as well. Whatever wisdom and counsel they had learned from Solomon was now available to his son Rehoboam, but he rejected their wisdom. Rehoboam's decision had spiritual ramifications, as all decisions do. But he wasn't making a spiritual decision as such, he was making a political decision. Would he be more kingly by being gentle or by being tough? And here we see secular wisdom. The advice of the elders was wise, as we would have expected, considering that they had lived and worked with Solomon. The advice of Rehoboam's peers was foolishness. We've all met someone like Rehoboam, arrogant, cannot be told anything. Rather than listen to the wise men who had seen his father Solomon in action, he listened to his peers, to those who had no more wisdom or experience than he had. And it would be easy to draw a quick lesson here. Old people have better advice than young people. But that's not always true. I know in my own life that age isn't everything. I was 20 when my grandfather passed away. I loved him dearly, but he wasn't the mature Christian that my father was. In those days, if I needed godly advice, I went to my father. What is true is that the elders had been hanging around with Solomon, a wise man, even if spiritually in decline. And the young men had been hanging around with Rehoboam. As they talked with each other, they reinforced their own prejudices. They didn't look for godly advice and counsel, and they didn't even look to the wisdom of Solomon. So a better lesson would be this. When you seek counsel, don't just look for those who will reinforce your prejudices and your beliefs. Look for wise advice, or better yet, godly advice. So the king did not listen to the people, for this turn of events was from the Lord, to fulfill the word the Lord had spoken to Jeroboam, son of Nebat, through Ahijah the Shilonite. God told Solomon this would happen. God spoke to Jeroboam through Abijah the prophet, telling him that this would happen. How did God know about that before it happened? Would God's plan have been foiled if Rehoboam had accepted good advice? There are those who think that God is bound to time. Some of them think that God can only know the future if he makes it happen. They think that God must have caused Rehoboam to act foolishly. Others think that God has to wait like we do to find out what happens next. They think that God couldn't have known what Rehoboam would do until he did it. However, we serve the great I Am, the eternal God. Genesis 1:1 tells us that God was already there at the beginning. He created time. In 1 Samuel 23, we learn that God even knows what might have been. So I don't think we should be surprised that God knows the future. God knew what Rehoboam would do. God's plans cannot be foiled. When all Israel saw that the king refused to listen to them, they answered the king, "What share do we have in David? What part in Jesse's son? To your tents, O Israel. Look after your own house, O David." And so the Israelites went home. Notice here that the Israelites, by rejecting David's grandson, are in fact rejecting the house of David and his descendants. In rejecting the house of David, they're rejecting the God of David. They're rejecting the God of Israel. They probably didn't see it that way. From their point of view, they didn't get what they wanted, and they reacted accordingly. What they were asking for was not even unreasonable. But in asking for this, and in breaking away from the house of David, they put themselves and their children in a state of rebellion against God. Rebellion against God does not go well. Israel, in breaking away from the house of David, broke with its godly roots. They descended into wickedness and idolatry, as we shall see. But as for the Israelites who were living in the towns of Judah, Rehoboam still ruled over them. Jeroboam was crowned king over most of Israel, and so there were two kingdoms. The northern kingdom was still called Israel because it was most of Israel. The southern kingdom, which remained under the control of Rehoboam, was called Judah because that tribe was the only one left. Jeroboam thought to himself, "The kingdom will now likely revert to the house of David. If these people go up to offer sacrifices at the temple of the Lord in Jerusalem, they will again give their allegiance to their Lord, Rehoboam, king of Judah. They will kill me and return to King Rehoboam." What did Jeroboam know of God? He had worked for Solomon, so he certainly knew of the temple in Jerusalem. He knew, as all Israel knew, that they were to worship God in the temple according to the law of Moses. He'd had an encounter with Ahijah, the prophet of God. Everything the prophet had predicted had come true. This should have impressed him with the truth and the power of the Lord. He had gone from being an official in Solomon's kingdom to being king over most of Israel. That should have sparked a gratitude toward God. And then Jeroboam had been promised a dynasty on the condition that he be spiritually loyal to the Lord God. But Jeroboam foresaw a problem of political loyalty. If Israel continued to worship the Lord as they'd done in the past, they would continue to go to Jerusalem in the kingdom of Judah. Their loyalty would be divided, and he didn't want that to happen. After seeking advice, the king made 2 golden calves. He said to the people, "It's too much for you to go up to Jerusalem. Here are your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of Egypt." One he set up in Bethel, and the other in Dan. And this thing became a sin. The people went even as far as Dan to worship the one there. Jeroboam too sought advice. Although the issue was spiritual, instead of seeking out a prophet of the Lord, he followed ungodly advice. The idea of worshiping golden calves goes back to the time of Moses. In Exodus 32, while Moses was meeting God on the top of Mount Sinai and receiving the 10 Commandments, Aaron helped the Israelites to make a golden idol in the shape of a calf. Jeroboam was creating an excuse for the people. These idols, these golden calves, would save the people the trouble of going to Jerusalem for worship. Imagine worshiping a false god because it was more convenient. But the people went along with it. Jeroboam built shrines on high places and appointed priests from all sorts of people, even though they were not Levites. It seems here that Jeroboam also kept the worship of the Lord. But there were 2 sins involved here. First, there were the shrines in the high places. This is not where God wanted to be worshipped. He was to be worshipped at the temple in Jerusalem. And second, the priests of God were supposed to be chosen from the descendants of Levi, of the tribe of Levi. But Jeroboam was making priests out of just anyone. So Jeroboam had priests who shouldn't really be priests, leading the people to worship God in shrines that were not his temple. He instituted a festival on the 15th day of the 8th month, like the festival held in Judah, and offered sacrifices on the altar. This he did in Bethel, sacrificing to the calves he had made. And at Bethel he also installed priests at the high places he had made. This festival was meant to mimic the festival in Judah, so that the people wouldn't go to the one in Judah. And on the 15th day of the 8th month, a month of his own choosing, he offered sacrifices on the altar he had built at Bethel. And so he instituted the festival for the Israelites and went up to the altar to make offerings. In a month of his own choosing, Jeroboam instituted a festival, not of God's choosing or of Moses or the high priests. This is without a doubt a man-made religion. But notice there's something here for everyone. For those who like tradition, he's keeping the old festival, just changing the location. For those who want change, he has a new festival. For those who want something a little mysterious, he has borrowed from the other religions around about them. And there are the golden calves. And some might even want to pretend that these golden calves are the Lord. But for those with a more traditional understanding of God, there are those shrines closer to home. No need for a long trek to Jerusalem to worship God. And the priests, they may not be Levites, but they look and speak and act like priests. Such a hodgepodge. And this too is characteristic of man-made religion. Do-it-yourself faith. You can worship God any way you choose. Religion doesn't matter. All religions lead to God, and so on. We worship the God of the Bible. Those who remake God according to their way of thinking, who refashion him after modern philosophy or our theology or current worldview, they will end up worshiping a distortion of God. Now, I'll grant you that Jeroboam represents the far extreme. We do not, nor would we, do the things that Jeroboam did. He was disobedient. He deliberately perverted the truth, and undermined the worship of the Lord. But notice, though he was given a promise by God, he took matters into his own hands. Instead of obeying and trusting God, he tried to establish his kingdom by manipulating the people and the situation. Don't we do that sometimes? Try to manipulate the situation? Try to achieve the right result in the wrong way? Both Solomon and Jeroboam worshipped idols. And yet Jeroboam's name becomes almost a curse later on in this book. All that happens to Solomon is that he loses his kingdom during the reign of his son. What's the difference that God sees between them? Keep in mind that Solomon started out with a heart to serve God. He was led astray. His wives led him astray, for which he was punished. But he did not set his face against God like Jeroboam did. Solomon built the idols, etc., for his foreign wives. Jeroboam set up the calves, not for the foreign women living among the people, but for the people of Israel themselves. He deliberately turned his people away from the Lord. Both Solomon and Jeroboam were promised God's blessing if they walked in his ways. Solomon slid into the worship of false gods in a gradual process of compromise. Jeroboam made a political calculation without any consideration for God or his promise. He deliberately led the Israelites into idolatry. Jeroboam had set his face against God. In 1 Kings 3, we read, "If you walk in my ways and obey my statutes and commands, as David your father did, I will give you long life." I mentioned that God had appeared to Solomon twice. This verse takes us back to the first time, when Solomon prayed for wisdom. And this pleased God so that he granted Solomon wisdom and wealth and honor besides. And that's when God made the first promise, "If you walk in my ways like David, I will give you long life." In 1 Kings 9, "If you walk before me in integrity of heart and uprightness, as David your father did, and do all I command and observe my decrees and laws, I will establish your royal throne over Israel forever." This verse takes us to the second time that God appeared to Solomon, after he prayed to dedicate the temple he had built for the worship of God. "If you walk in my ways like David, I will establish your throne. If you do whatever I command you, and walk in my ways, and do what is right in my eyes by keeping my statutes and commands, as David my servant did, I will be with you." This is God's word to Jeroboam through the prophet. God was about to bless Jeroboam beyond his wildest dreams. He would rule over most of Solomon's kingdom with all its splendor, but the prophet Ahijah added a promise from God, "If you walk in my ways like David, I'll be with you." These promises made to Solomon and to Jeroboam were old covenant promises. They were about material and physical blessings. They were about earthly kingdoms. But the principle is the same under the new covenant. If we want God's blessing, we must walk in his ways. We are offered spiritual blessings, the presence of God, the fruits of the Spirit, being part of Christ's kingdom and eternity with him, if we walk in his ways, if we walk with the Spirit, keeping in step with him. You and I are here this morning because we're not like Jeroboam, who set his face against God. Nor are we like Rehoboam, who had no particular interest in the faith of his father and his grandfather. But let's not be like Solomon either, who began by walking with God and then let other things draw him away from his wholehearted devotion to God. Rather, let's follow after David, who in each of these verses is set forth as the example. Does that mean we'll be perfect? David wasn't perfect. His sins are recorded in the Bible. He sinned, but he repented because he had a heart for God. Therefore, let us be single-minded, wholehearted in our devotion to God, and let us give our lives entirely to Him.